Hey there. So I kind of want to try to continue in Galatians here. I'm sorry, I'm not getting back to comments as fast as I'd like in emails. I've been really busy. The only time I'm doing YouTube really is while I'm driving, and I'm not even keeping up with my various chat groups right now. I'm kind of in a busier season. But I do want to correct one error I made. I said that Paul brought a Greek into the temple. And for some reason I read that he did. He was accused of it by the Jewish people in Asia when James and the brothers told him to go into the temple to take a vow. The reason a riot broke out, one of the reasons, was because the Jews were accusing him of bringing a Gentile into the temple. And when he stood before Festus, he said, "No, I've never done anything to offend the traditions." And someone pointed that out to me, and I need to correct it. And it made me think quite a bit about Paul's treatment of the law and how the law is so central in Israel. See, he had to say, "No, I've not offended the traditions," because he was being accused of sedition and stirring up state rebellion against the state, because in Israel, the law of Moses is also the civil law. So to disobey it, it's a big deal. And I'm going to do a separate message about that, about how Paul had the freedom to use the law in terms of as a missionary, just like Hudson Taylor, when he went to China, dressed like a Chinese man and learned the Chinese language and learned their customs and adopted to it. That's how Paul was in Israel. And he was he actually in grace had the freedom to be all things to all people and even observe Jewish traditions, like when he had Timothy circumcised, without violating the gospel, because it wasn't dead works. He wasn't trying to satisfy his conscience with those things. He was trying to be sensitive to the culture. And also, it went so far as when James was telling him, "Okay, we have brothers that have taken a vow. I want you to take a vow and go into the temple to show that you've not apostatized from Moses, walking orderly, keeping the law." I've honestly always thought that was a statement against grace. But actually, I can see that, no, James was acting on Paul's behalf because Paul was being accused. He knew Paul was being accused of creating disorder in the country through his teachings. And so he said, "Show them that you've not apostatized from Moses and walk orderly, keeping the law." And as a Gentile under grace, we say, "Wait a second, I'm not under law. He can't send that message." And it does have implications for us for the gospel if he was doing any of that to be justified or as a dead work, like Hebrews says. But Paul was actually being sensitive to the political situation in Israel, because the law, again, is not just ceremonial, it's their civil law. And to teach, when James is saying you walk orderly, you did not apostatize from Moses, you walk orderly, keeping the law, what he's saying, I always thought that meant that you're justified by works. Show them that you're justified by works. But now I'm starting to see what he's saying is, you're not a sower of sedition. You're not throwing off our government. See, he was brought to Festus. He was imprisoned for sowing discord and sedition and rebellion against the government through his religious teachings. And that is really difficult for us to understand in the church, that in Israel, the law was not just a spiritual thing, but was civil. So that, a friend of mine, or one of my subscribers, sent me an email saying, hey, Paul never took a Greek into the into the temple. He even said he never did. He never did anything to offend the customs of the Jews. So I had to rethink that and go read it again and see, yeah, he didn't bring a Greek. He was just accused of that. But that caused me to see even more that Paul was using his freedom to be all things to all people. It's amazing. We cannot impose the law on anybody, but we can partake of anything. We're free from the elements of this world to use them sensitively to the culture in a missionary way, And it would be stupid not to. It would be stupid for Paul to go to Israel. If he's going to live as a Jew while he's among the Jews, then he's got to observe the feasts and everything. Is that against the one-time sacrifice of the Lord? Well, it would be if he was broadcasting that this is how he was justified or sanctified, or that it had anything to do with pleasing God. But as a matter of civil obedience, then there's nothing wrong with it. It's very interesting. So that's an area where I need to mature in my understanding for sure, and it's got some implications for my understanding. We'll just say it that way. About how Paul was among the Jewish people who sought to be justified by works. They were wrong in doing that, and he did not support them in doing that. But he also didn't walk in a way that offended their customs, even though he was accused of it. So that's kind of interesting. Now today, if you find a Christian who's put themselves under law for justification or anything like that, you have no obligation to be sensitive to that, because that's not culture. That's apostasy and lack of clarity about the truth. Whereas back then in Israel, the law was not just the spiritual moral law, but it was the law of the land. And we're to obey the law. When Paul called the high priest a whitewashed tomb, the high priest, one of the guards slapped him and said, how can you address a high priest that way? And Paul said, I didn't know he was the high priest. And then he used a scripture. He said, it's written you're not supposed to speak against your elders. And that always confused me. It's like, what, is he submitting to that again? No. The religious law in Israel is also civil, with real consequences for infractions. It's just something we have to keep in mind, because really there's some things that happened when Paul went to Israel that we don't understand, because we don't know what it's like to live back then. We don't know what it's like to live as a Jew under those laws, as a member of the nation. So I've done the best I can with my understanding of the book of Acts as a Gentile, believer in the under the church age, that can't really relate to this marriage, this theocracy, this marriage of state and religion, which that's how they operated. If you were going to live among the Jews, that's how you had to function. It's very difficult for us to understand, but that's the way it was. So no, Paul didn't offend their customs. I was wrong in that. I still think it was a trap for him to go to Jerusalem. He was told it would be, and it was for him to be delivered over to the Gentiles and put an end to his public ministry, and God had to bring it to a head, because the Jewish branch had been cut off, and there's a new dispensation, and God's working with the church, and he's got to make it clear. And all that had to lead up to the destruction of the temple. As long as the temple stood and there was this marriage between the moral and the civil law for Israel, the church struggled to go on in the truth, because it was being Galatianized with this mix of law and grace from the Jewish believers. who lived as Jews. That's the hard thing to understand, is we don't ask anybody to absolutely forsake all their culture to become a believer, right? No, we ask them to be a believer and they're justified. And then over time, they, grow in the knowledge of Christ, But in Israel, you've got this situation where the civil law is the law. And that's the custom of the people, and that's what you grow up with. And you're zealous for the law, and you believe in Jesus. Is that a problem? Not for you, but for the church, eventually it is. So God had to clean that up. But on the other hand, you can't really fault the people for being saturated with their culture, nor can you expect them to suddenly just drop everything, Now in Galatians, the problem was that the Jews were introducing this culture to Gentiles and saying, you have to keep this. And so it was a matter of dead works, because it was for justification or sanctification. And that's a problem, whether you're a Jew living as a Jew or a Gentile living apart from all those things. If you're operating in dead works, trying to clean yourself up for God and try to establish a ground of being pleasing to Him based on anything other than the blood of Jesus Christ, then you're counting the blood an unclean thing, and you're apostatizing, Doesn't mean you're going to lose your salvation, but you're not clear. You come under the curse of the law. Christ has made of no effect for you. So the Jews had to learn to live Christ, even though they were absorbed with all this culture that was related to God, but wasn't. Like, it all pointed to God, but it had been diverted. And America is kind of like that today. The Christianity of America is nothing like biblical New Testament Christianity. But we live in a culture where we're just saturated, and everybody goes to church and everybody does their stuff, It's a difficult, it's a minefield for a believer. It's kind of funny today. I talked about my channel, and today we met my wife's friend from college, and they had a singing ministry together and went on crusades, and they're both very involved in their churches, and her husband is involved in his church. And of course the question comes, Dave, what are you doing? You going to church? I'm like, no, I can't really do the institutional church thing. And I find myself saying, well, I've got a YouTube channel, and that's where I have my fellowship. And I'm finding that, I'm almost embarrassed to talk about it. And it's just kind of funny because, this channel is something that I do out of my enjoyment for Christ, and I so appreciate the fellowship, and it's been such a blessing, and I know it's the flow of the Lord, for me to speak this way. I wasn't always able to speak like this. There's a flow. But people on the outside don't know that, Dave. They have no idea what I'm doing on my channel, and if I say I'm doing a YouTube channel, they say, oh, well, you doing Bible studies? Well, yeah, And you can only imagine what they think that must look like. They're like, why aren't you going to church? That can't be a replacement for church. And I don't want to get into some big argument about any of it, make my wife and her friends uncomfortable. And my wife agrees with me, but she knows what I believe about grace, and that there's just no food in the institutional church. And I don't think I could do this channel in a good conscience while I was going to an institutional church. That would be really something. But that's our culture, and we had to be kind of sensitive to it. We're free to do whatever we need to do to be sensitive to that culture. I guess I could go to a church if I wanted to, but I don't have any need to. But still, it was just, there's a stigma, you're not doing anything in their view. And it would be the same thing if you were a Jew in Israel not partaking of the feasts and stuff. I don't know if I think a lot of the Jews did keep partaking of the feast because it's what their culture did. And they weren't condemned for doing so as long as they didn't think that justified them. And eventually Hebrews had to be written because it became too unclear, anyway, Paul was not trying to stir up trouble by bringing a Greek into the temple, and that was a false accusation. And I'm understanding more that whole scene with him taking a vow, and even James asking him to, wasn't necessarily about something religious. For him to say, show them that you've not apostatized from Moses and walk orderly, keeping the law, may have been saying, show them that when you're a Jew in Israel, you're obedient to the law. You're not a rebel, a criminal. I mean, he was jailed eventually, for that very thing. So a theocracy is different, and we can't really understand or grasp it, but it was a very complicated situation. And so I don't want to cast too much shade on James in that situation, and I want to correct my error about Paul in that situation. That's complicated. So I thank her for bringing it to my attention. I didn't feel like I could go on with Galatians without making the record straight. If you got an error out there that you're aware of, you got to address it. All right, take care.